On a gray morning in October of 1979, Harlan Tesdall drove a second-hand tractor up the steepest ridge on his farm in Chickasaw County, Iowa, with 40 persimmon saplings strapped to the back, and not a single neighbor who thought he was doing anything but losing his mind. The saplings were spindly. The ridge was rocky. The soil up there was thin and full of chert, and everyone who farmed that county knew that thin, cherty soil on a steep slope was good for exactly one thing, which was growing rocks and maybe cedar if you let it go long enough. Harlan knew all of that. He planted the persimmons anyway. Let me tell you about Harlan Tesdall, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did, and you need to understand what he did before you can understand why. 43 years later, his granddaughter was standing in front of 200 farmers at the Chickasaw County Extension Service meeting, holding a check for $18,000 and explaining why the worst ground on the farm had become the most valuable. Harlan was 61 years old in 1979. He had farmed the same 480 acres in Chickasaw County since 1947, when his father handed him the deed in a handshake and told him not to embarrass the family name. He hadn't. He had farmed those 480 acres the way every serious farmer in that county farmed. Corn and soybeans in rotation on the flat ground, hay on the gentle slopes, and a general, collective, unspoken agreement that the ridge ground at the back of the property was a liability you managed rather than an asset you developed. The ridge ran about 60 acres, steep and rocky and wooded in patches, and it had never in the history of the Tesdall farm produced $1 of meaningful income. It produced erosion. It produced cedar encroachment. It produced the particular frustration of land you own but cannot use, ground that sits on your deed like a sentence you cannot finish. Harlan's neighbors had handled their ridge ground in the usual ways. Some had let it go to scrub timber and leased the hunting rights for $20 an acre to whoever asked first. Some had pushed the cedar and tried to get grass established, running a few cow-calf pairs up there in summer and losing money slowly. A few had simply written it off, treating those acres as buffer between their productive ground and the county road, a green edge on the aerial photograph that nobody thought much about. None of them had planted persimmons. None of them had thought to. Let me tell you about what Harlan Tesdall was thinking in 1979, because it wasn't mystical, and it wasn't accidental, and it wasn't the product of some vision he'd had in a dream. It was the product of 40 years of watching deer. Harlan had grown up hunting that ridge. His father had hunted it before him, and his grandfather before that, and the one thing every generation of Tesdalls had noticed, without ever quite articulating it as a principle, was that the deer came to the ridge in October, and they came for a reason. They came because of the wild persimmons. There were 3 old persimmon trees on the east face of the ridge, trees that had been there longer than anyone could remember, and every October when those trees dropped their fruit, the deer concentrated on that east face in a way they concentrated nowhere else on the farm. Not the corn, not the soybean stubble, not the creek bottom with its thick cover. The persimmons. The deer wanted the persimmons with a single-mindedness that Harlan had spent 4 decades observing, and what he had concluded from 4 decades of observation was simple. If 3 trees drew that many deer, 40 trees would draw more. The question was what to do with more deer. In 1979, that question had an obvious answer, which was nothing particularly profitable, because deer hunting in Iowa in 1979 was not yet the commercial enterprise it would become. Non-resident deer hunting licenses existed but were not yet in high demand. Deer lease hunting as a formal business model was practiced in Texas and a few southern states, but had not yet migrated meaningfully into the upper Midwest. The infrastructure for turning deer into income, the outfitters, the lease brokers, the online platforms, the culture of paying serious money for access to serious deer habitat did not yet exist in Chickasaw County, Iowa, in any form that Harlan could have pointed to and said, "Here is my business plan." What Harlan had instead was a conviction, which is a different thing from a business plan but sometimes more durable. He had a conviction, built from 40 years of watching those 3 trees, that the deer were there for a reason, and that the reason was replicable. He had a conviction that the ridge ground, which everyone agreed was useless for row crops, was not useless in any absolute sense, but only useless for the thing everyone was trying to do with it. He had a conviction that land had more than one kind of value, and that the kind of value everyone was measuring was not the only kind worth measuring. He did not say any of this out loud. Harlan Tesdahl was not a man who explained himself at length. He drove the tractor up the ridge in October of 1979, planted 40 persimmon saplings in the thin, cherty soil, and drove back down. His neighbor, Dale Crowley, saw him doing it. Let me tell you about Dale Crowley, because Dale is important to this story in the way that a certain kind of man is always important to stories like this. Not because he was cruel or stupid, but because he was confident, and confidence in the absence of curiosity is its own kind of blindness. Dale Crowley was 54 years old in 1979, and he farmed 620 acres in Chickasaw County with a precision and efficiency that everyone in the county recognized and respected. He was a good farmer in every measurable sense. His yields were consistently above county average. His equipment was maintained and current. He served on the county extension board and the local co-op board, and was the kind of man whose opinion was solicited and whose opinion, once given, tended to settle the matter. Dale Crowley did not second-guess himself, and he did not, as a general rule, understand men who did things that required explanation. He pulled his truck over on the county road and watched Harlan come down off the ridge on the tractor, and when Harlan got close enough, Dale leaned out the window and asked what he was doing up there. Harlan told him, "Persimmons for the deer." Dale Crowley was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Harlan, you're planting fruit trees on ground that won't grow corn, to feed animals you can't sell, on the theory that someday somebody's going to pay you for the privilege of shooting them." He paused. "You been out in the sun too long?" Harlan said he didn't think so. Dale said, "That ridge ground has never made you $1, and those trees aren't going to change that. Persimmons take 10 years to bear. You'll be 71 before you see the first fruit." Harlan said, "I know." Dale looked at him for another moment, then put his truck in gear and drove away. He told the story at the co-op that week, and the men who heard it laughed in the way that men laugh at things they find both foolish and harmless, which is to say they laughed with a certain fondness, the way you laugh at an uncle who collects something nobody else collects. It wasn't mean. It was the laughter of people who were sure they understood the limits of the possible and who found it mildly entertaining when someone else didn't share that understanding. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched someone do a thing that made no sense to you at the time, and then watched the years go by, and watched the thing they did accumulate meaning the way a river accumulates water? Slowly, invisibly, and then all at once? That's what happened on that ridge in Chickasaw County. Not quickly, not dramatically, quietly, over years the way most important things happen. The persimmons did not bear fruit for 9 years. Harlan had said 10. It was 9. In the fall of 1988, the first meaningful crop of persimmons dropped from the trees he'd planted on the east face of the ridge, and the deer came. They came the way they had always come to the original 3 trees, but now they came in larger numbers and they stayed longer because there was more fruit and it was spread across a longer section of the ridge. Harlan's son, Gary, who had grown up rolling his eyes at the persimmon project the way farm kids roll their eyes at their father's obsessions, walked the ridge that October and counted 14 different deer in a single afternoon. He came back to the house and told his father, and Harlan nodded and said he'd expected about that. Gary asked what they were going to do about it. Harlan said he wasn't sure yet. The infrastructure still wasn't there. Deer leases in Iowa in 1988 were still not the business they would become, but they were becoming it, slowly, and Harlan could feel the direction of travel even if he couldn't see the destination. He had planted the trees in 1979, not because he had a finished plan, but because he understood that the plan would only be possible if the trees existed, and the trees took 9 years to bear, and so the trees had to come first. You could not wait until the market was ready and then plant the trees. By the time the market was ready, the trees would be 9 years from bearing. You had to plant the trees when everyone thought you were foolish, and then wait, which was the part that most people found impossible. Harlan Tesdall found it entirely possible. He was a farmer. Waiting was the job. Let me tell you about what was happening in Iowa in the years between 1988 and 1995, because it matters to this story in ways that weren't obvious at the time. The whitetail deer population in Iowa was growing, and growing significantly, as it was across much of the upper Midwest. Agricultural abundance, mild winters, and reduced predator pressure had produced a deer herd that, by the early 1990s, was large enough to make Iowa deer hunting a destination, rather than just a local tradition. Non-resident hunters from Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and eventually from much farther away, began to understand that Iowa produced trophy whitetails at a rate that few states could match. The Boone and Crockett records were filling up with Iowa deer. The hunting magazines were running Iowa on their covers. The demand for access to Iowa ground was beginning to outpace the supply of farmers willing to provide it. Harlan watched all of this from his ridge in Chickasaw County with the calm attention of a man who had been waiting for something he already knew was coming. He added another 20 persimmon trees to the ridge in 1991, extending the planting toward the north face where a natural funnel between 2 draws concentrated deer movement in ways he had observed for years. He ran a 2-strand electric fence along the lower edge of the ridge to keep the neighbors' cattle from wandering up and browsing the saplings. He put in a small food plot of clover in the flat at the base of the ridge where a spring seep kept the ground moist through dry summers. He did all of this without announcing it, without explaining it, and without, as far as anyone could tell, consulting anyone. Gary watched his father work the ridge through the early 1990s and began to understand, slowly and then completely, what his father was building. It was not a farm. It was not a timber operation. It was not quite a hunting preserve in any formal sense. It was a habitat system, assembled piece by piece over 15 years, designed around the specific movement patterns and food preferences of white-tailed deer in Chickasaw County, Iowa, and it was becoming, by the mid-1990s, something genuinely remarkable. The deer density on the Tesdall Ridge was, by any informal measure, extraordinary. Neighbors who ran trail cameras on their ground — trail cameras were new then, bulky and expensive — would occasionally find images of deer moving through their properties in the direction of the Tesdall Ridge. The deer knew where the food was. The deer always know. In the fall of 1994, a man named Rick Hodges drove up the Tesdall driveway in a truck with Wisconsin plates. He was 38 years old, worked in insurance in Madison, and had been hunting whitetails seriously for 15 years. He had heard about the Tesdall ground from a man who had heard about it from another man, the way information travels in hunting circles, which is to say imperfectly and with considerable embellishment, but with a directional accuracy that eventually delivers the right person to the right place. Rick Hodges sat at Harlan's kitchen table and told him he would pay $400 for the right to hunt the ridge for 3 days that November. Harlan's wife, Edna, set a cup of coffee in front of Rick Hodges and looked at her husband across the table with an expression that said nothing and communicated everything. Harlan asked Rick Hodges how he'd heard about the place. Rick told him. Harlan was quiet for a moment. Then he said he'd have to think about it. Rick Hodges drove back to Wisconsin. 3 days later, Harlan called him and said yes. $400 for 3 days, 1 deer, no guarantees. Rick Hodges said that was fine. He came in November, hunted the east face of the ridge where the persimmons were heaviest, and on the second morning he shot a 150-inch 10-point buck that would have been the best deer of his life regardless of where he'd shot it. He drove out of the Tesdall driveway with the deer in his truck bed and $400 lighter, and he was smiling in a way that suggested he considered this an excellent transaction. Harlan deposited the $400 and did not mention it to Dale Crowley. Let me tell you about the next 5 years, because they are the years when the thing Harlan had built in patient obscurity began to announce itself to the world, and the world's reaction was instructive. Word moved through the non-resident hunting community the way word always moves in that world. Slowly at first, then in a rush. By 1997, Harlan was fielding inquiries from hunters in Wisconsin, Illinois, Minnesota, and Indiana. By 1999, he had a waiting list. He was charging $800 for a 3-day hunt and $1,200 for a week, and he was turning people away. He had not advertised. He had not listed the property with any outfitter or lease broker. He had not built a website or printed a brochure. He had planted persimmon trees on a rocky ridge in 1979 and waited 20 years, and the world had found him. Gary Tesdall, who by 2000 was running most of the day-to-day farm operation while his father, now 82, moved at a slower pace, sat down with a legal pad one evening and did the arithmetic. The 60 acres of ridge ground that had never in the history of the Tesdall farm produced meaningful income was now generating, in lease and day hunt revenue, between $8,000 and $12,000 per year. The flat ground, the corn and soybean ground that everyone understood to be the productive ground, the real ground, the ground worth farming, was generating, after input costs, somewhere between $40 and $60 per acre per year in net income. The ridge ground, at current hunting revenue, was generating somewhere between $130 and $200 per acre per year, on land that grew rocks and cedar, on land that Dale Crowley had looked at in 1979 and seen as a liability. Gary showed his father the numbers. Harlan looked at the legal pad for a long moment and then looked out the window at the ridge, which was bare and gray in the November light, and said, "The persimmons are bearing well this year." Gary said they were. Harlan said, "Good." That was the entirety of his commentary on 21 years of vindication. Now, let me tell you about Dale Crowley, because Dale's story did not end in 1979 when he drove away from Harlan on the county road. Dale farmed his 620 acres through the 1980s and 1990s with the same precision and efficiency that had always defined him, and he did well by the standards of that era, which is to say, he survived the farm crisis of the mid-1980s with his land intact, which was not nothing, and he continued to produce above-average yields through the 1990s, and he continued to serve on the co-op board and the extension board and to be the kind of man whose opinion settled matters. His ridge ground, he had about 45 acres of it, similar terrain to Harlan's. He had leased to a local hunting club for $22 an acre since 1985. It was a handshake deal with a group of men he knew from church, and it generated about $1,000 a year, which Dale considered satisfactory for ground that wasn't good for anything else. In the fall of 2001, Dale's hunting club told him they were disbanding. 3 of the members had gotten too old to hunt seriously. 1 had moved away, and the remaining 2 didn't want to carry the lease alone. Dale found himself with 45 acres of ridge ground and no lease agreement for the first time in 16 years. He put the word out at the co-op and the feed store that he had hunting ground available, and he waited for the phone to ring. The phone did not ring the way he expected. The men who called were local men who offered him $20 or $25 an acre, which was what local hunting leases went for in Chickasaw County in 2001, and Dale said he'd think about it. He had heard, by this point, what was happening on the Tesdall Ridge. The county was not large. Information traveled. He knew that Harlan was getting non-resident hunters to pay serious money for access to that ground, and he had a general sense of the revenue involved, though not the specifics. He also knew, because he was an honest man when it came to his own land, that his ridge ground did not have what the Tesdall Ridge had. His ridge had scrub timber and some native grass and a few scattered wild plum thickets, but it did not have persimmons. It did not have the food source that concentrated deer in the way the Tesdall Ridge concentrated them. It did not have, in short, 22 years of patient habitat development. Dale Crowley drove up the Tesdall driveway on a Saturday morning in November of 2001. Harlan was sitting on the porch in a heavy coat, watching the ridge. He was 83 years old and moved carefully, but his eyes were still sharp and his mind was entirely intact. Dale got out of his truck and stood at the bottom of the porch steps, and there was a moment between them that carried the full weight of 22 years. Dale said, "Harlan, I've got a question for you." Harlan said, "I expect you do." Dale asked him about the persimmons, not in a general way. Dale Crowley was not a general way kind of man, but specifically. What varieties had he planted? How had he spaced them? How long before they bore reliably? What he'd done about the deer browsing the young trees? Whether the cherty soil had been a problem or whether it had actually suited the persimmons, which Dale had heard somewhere preferred well-drained ground. He asked these questions with the focused attention of a man who had decided to learn something and was going to learn it thoroughly, and Harlan answered each question in the same order it was asked, without editorializing, without saying anything about 1979 or the county road or the laughter at the co-op. When they had been through all of it, Dale stood at the bottom of the porch steps for a moment and then said, "I should have asked you these questions 20 years ago." Harlan said, "Yes." Dale said, "You knew it would work." Harlan said, "I thought it would work. There's a difference." Dale nodded. He said he was going to plant persimmons on his ridge in the spring. He asked if Harlan had a nursery he recommended. Harlan went inside and came back with a business card, worn at the corners, from a native plant nursery in northeast Iowa. He handed it to Dale. Dale took it, looked at it, and put it in his shirt pocket. He said, "Thank you, Harlan." Harlan said, "Plant them on the east and southeast faces if you can. That's where they'll bear best, and that's where the deer will find them first." Dale said he would. He got back in his truck and drove down the driveway, and Harlan watched him go and then went back to watching the ridge. Let me tell you about what happened after, because the story doesn't end with Dale Crowley's visit, and it doesn't end with Harlan Tesdall on his porch. The story continues, and the continuation is the part that matters most. Harlan Tesdall died in March of 2004 at the age of 85 in the farmhouse where he had lived for 57 years. He died in the early morning, quietly, in the way that men who have lived without drama tend to die. Gary and his wife were there. The funeral was held at the Methodist Church in the county seat, and the attendance was larger than the family expected, which is often the way with men who do not seek attention. When they are gone, the full weight of what they were becomes visible in a way it wasn't while they were present. Dale Crowley was there. He sat in the third row and did not say much to anyone. Gary inherited the farm. He inherited the flat ground and the hay ground and the 60 acres of ridge with its persimmon trees, now 25 years old and bearing heavily every fall, and the waiting list of non-resident hunters that had grown by 2004 to 37 names. He also inherited something less tangible, which was his father's understanding of what the ridge was and what it was for, and that understanding shaped every decision he made about the property in the years that followed. Gary added food plots. He worked with the Iowa Department of Natural Resources on a cost-share program for native warm-season grasses on the lower slopes of the ridge, which improved the bedding cover and kept deer on the property through the daylight hours rather than just during feeding. He planted additional persimmon trees, a more productive variety he'd found through the Extension Service, a cultivar called Meter that bore more reliably and more heavily than the wild-type trees his father had planted. He built 2 elevated box blinds on the ridge, positioned at spots his father had identified as the best observation points, spots Harlan had identified by walking the ridge in the snow and reading the deer sign the way you read a letter, looking for what the animal was trying to tell you about where it wanted to be. By 2010, the Tesdall Ridge operation was generating between $15,000 and $20,000 per year in hunting revenue. The waiting list had 42 names on it. Gary was charging $1,800 for a 3-day hunt and $2,800 for a week, and he was still turning people away. The flat ground, 420 acres of corn and soybeans, was generating, after input costs, somewhere between $50 and $70 per acre per year in net income. The ridge was generating somewhere between $250 and $330 per acre per year, on 60 acres of ground that had never, before 1979, produced a meaningful dollar. Let me tell you about Gary's daughter, Maren Tesdall, because she is the reason this story has a second chapter, and because she is, in some ways, the most important person in it. Maren was born in 1985, which means she was born 6 years after her grandfather planted the Persimmons, and she grew up on the farm the way farm kids grow up, knowing the land before she knew how to name what she knew. She helped Gary with the food plots when she was 12. She walked the ridge with her grandfather when she was 15, the last good years of his mobility, and he showed her the original 3 persimmon trees, the ones that had been there before he arrived, the ones that had started everything, and told her to remember where they were. She remembered. Maren went to Iowa State University and studied wildlife biology, which surprised no one who knew her and baffled everyone who didn't, because wildlife biology was not what farm daughters from Chickasaw County studied, or at least it wasn't what they had studied before Maren. She came back to the farm in 2008 with a degree, a head full of research and ideas that made her father's eyes go wide in the way that a man's eyes go wide when he is trying to determine whether his child is brilliant or has been away too long. She sat down with Gary at the kitchen table in the fall of 2008 and laid out what she was thinking. The ridge operation was good, she said. It was genuinely good, and her grandfather had built something real. But it was operating below its potential, and the reason it was operating below its potential was that it was being managed as a hunting property rather than as an ecosystem. And those were two different things with two different outcomes. A hunting property was managed to produce shootable deer. An ecosystem was managed to produce the conditions that produce deer, which was a different and more fundamental objective. The difference, she said, was the difference between harvesting what was there and building what could be there. Gary set down his fork. Maren told him about browse management, the specific woody species that deer preferred in winter, and how their presence or absence shaped deer movement patterns across an entire season, not just in October when the persimmons were dropping. She told him about mass diversity, the principle that a ridge with persimmons and white oak and red oak and wild plum and crabapple produced a sequential massed crop that kept deer on the property from September through January, rather than concentrating them for 3 weeks in October and dispersing them for the rest of the season. She told him about bedding cover, the specific structure of native grasses and shrubs that deer used for thermal cover in winter, and how that structure, once established, became self-reinforcing. She told him that the research on Midwestern whitetail habitat showed consistently that properties with diverse native mast and structured bedding cover held deer at densities 2 to 3 times higher than properties managed primarily for food plots and mineral sites. Gary said, "Your grandfather knew most of this?" Maren said, "He knew the persimmon part. He figured that out by watching. I'm saying we can extend what he figured out across the whole 60 acres using the same principle." Gary said he needed to think about it. He thought about it for 3 weeks. Then he told Maren to draw up a plan. "Let me tell you about the science, because it matters and because Maren Tesdall had done the work, and the work was serious." The research she was drawing on came primarily from university extension programs in Iowa, Missouri, and Illinois, and from the Quality Deer Management Association's habitat research, and from a body of work on native mast species that had been accumulating since the 1990s. The core finding was consistent across all of it. White-tailed deer in the upper Midwest were not random in their movement. They were systematic. They moved in response to food availability, thermal cover, and security in that order of priority, and they were capable of maintaining home ranges of several hundred acres while concentrating their activity in areas as small as 5 or 10 acres when those areas provided all three. The implication for habitat management was direct. If you could create a 5-acre core within your property that provided high-quality food, thermal cover, and security simultaneously, you could hold deer on that core through the entire hunting season, and you could hold them at densities that would seem implausible to anyone managing the property conventionally. Maren's plan for the Tesdall Ridge was built around this principle. She proposed adding white oak and bur oak plantings on the upper portions of the ridge, where the soil was deep enough to support them, to provide early season mast before the persimmons peaked. She proposed a native shrub border of wild plum, hawthorn, and dogwood along the north face of the ridge, which would provide both late-season browse and thermal cover for bedding. She proposed removing the invasive honeysuckle that had colonized the lower ridge over the previous decade, which was consuming browse that native species would have provided, and providing cover that deer used for bedding, but that offered no food value. She proposed a specific timber stand improvement on the mature oak section at the west end of the ridge, a selective cut that would open the canopy and stimulate the understory growth that deer used for both browse and cover. And she proposed a water development, a small pond in the draw at the base of the ridge's north face, fed by the spring seep that already ran there, which would provide the one element the ridge currently lacked as a year-round deer habitat. The total cost of the plan, spread over 3 years, was approximately $14,000. The projected increase in hunting revenue, based on comparable properties in Iowa and Missouri that had undergone similar habitat development, was between $8,000 and $15,000 per year within 5 years of completion. Gary looked at the numbers for a long time. Then he said, "Your grandfather spent $400 on 40 persimmon trees in 1979, and it took him 15 years to see a return." Marin said, "I know." Gary said, "He was right." Marin said, "Yes." Gary said, "All right, start with the oaks." They started with the oaks in the spring of 2009. Marin planted 60 white oak seedlings and 40 bur oak seedlings on the upper ridge, using tree tubes to protect them from deer browse in their first 3 years. She removed the honeysuckle from the lower ridge over 2 seasons, using a cut stump herbicide treatment that killed the root systems and prevented resprouting. She established the native shrub border on the north face, using plugs from a native plant nursery in Decorah. The same nursery, it turned out, that Harlan had gotten his persimmon trees from 30 years earlier, still in business, still run by the same family. She hired a timber consultant to design the selective cut on the west oak section, and Gary did the logging himself over the winter of 2010, pulling the timber with a skidder and selling the logs to a mill in Waukon for enough to cover the cost of the pond excavation. The pond went in the spring of 2011. It was small, about 1/3 of an acre, but it was fed by the spring seep and held water through dry summers, and by the fall of 2011 it had become, as Marin had predicted it would, a focal point for deer movement on the ridge. Trail camera images from that fall showed deer using the pond at all hours, not just at dawn and dusk, which meant the pond was functioning as a security feature as well as a water source. Deer were comfortable enough in the surrounding habitat to visit in daylight. The 2011 hunting season was the first season in which the full habitat plan was operational, and the results were immediate and measurable. Gary had always kept records of deer sightings reported by hunters. It was the kind of systematic observation his father had practiced and that Gary had continued. And the 2011 report showed a 38% increase in deer sightings per hunter day compared to the 5-year average. The quality of deer observed also increased, which was harder to quantify but consistently reported. Hunters were seeing more mature bucks more frequently in daylight hours, which was the specific combination that drove hunting lease values in the non-resident market. Gary raised his rates. He was charging $2,200 for a 3-day hunt in 2011 and $3,400 for a week. The waiting list had grown to 51 names. Let me tell you about the fall of 2012, because it was the year that everything Marin had built was tested in a way she hadn't planned for and couldn't have anticipated. The summer of 2012 was the worst drought in Iowa in 25 years. The corn crop across Chickasaw County failed at a scale that hadn't been seen since the 1980s. Yields on the flat ground dropped by 40% or more. Farmers who had been running comfortable margins found themselves underwater. The county was quiet in a way that drought makes a county quiet. Not the quiet of contentment, but the quiet of people calculating what they can afford to lose. The drought affected deer habitat across the county. Native mass production collapsed. The wild persimmons on most properties produced almost nothing. White oak acorn crops, which had been building toward a heavy year, were thin and low quality. Deer that had been distributed across the county's agricultural landscape in normal years concentrated on whatever food sources remained, and the properties that had diverse, established habitat held deer that properties with conventional management lost to dispersal. The Tesdall Ridge held its deer. The persimmons, 33 years old now, deep-rooted and drought-tolerant in ways that younger plantings were not, produced a reduced but meaningful crop. The oaks that Marin had planted in 2009, now 3 years old, were too young to produce mast, but their presence had stimulated understory growth that provided browse. The pond held water through August and into September, when every seasonal pond in the county had gone dry. The native shrub border on the north face, the wild plum and hawthorn and dogwood, produced fruit that supplemented the persimmon crop and provided browse through October and November. The ridge was not unaffected by the drought, but it was resilient in a way that conventional hunting ground was not, and the deer responded to that resilience the way they always respond to food and water in a dry year, which is to concentrate on it with a single-mindedness that makes a trail camera look like a wildlife documentary. The 2012 hunting season on the Tesdall Ridge was the best in its history. Hunters reported seeing deer at a rate that none of them had seen on any property in the region. 2 hunters on the waiting list who had been waiting 4 years finally got their hunts, and both shot the best deer of their lives. The word that came back through the hunting community was not just that the Tesdall ground was good. The word was that in a drought year when every other property in Chickasaw County was struggling, the Tesdall Ridge had somehow gotten better. Marin knew why. She had built a system, not just a food plot. She had built a habitat that was resilient because it was diverse, that held deer because it provided everything deer needed rather than just one thing, that could absorb a drought year without collapsing because its food sources were layered across species and maturity and root depth in ways that no single stress event could eliminate simultaneously. It was the same principle her grandfather had applied when he planted persimmons on ground that everyone else had written off. The principle that the most valuable thing you can build is the thing that works when everything else doesn't. Gary called her from the farm in November of 2012 during the hunting season and said, "You need to come see this." She drove up from Iowa City, where she was doing graduate coursework in wildlife ecology, and walked the ridge with her father in the November light. The deer sign was extraordinary. Rubs on trees, scrapes in the soft ground, tracks in the mud around the pond, trails worn into the native grass on the north face that hadn't existed 3 years earlier. It looked like a property that had been professionally managed for decades, which in a sense it had been, though the management had been done by a retired farmer's granddaughter working from university research and her grandfather's example. Gary said, "Your grandfather would have liked this." Marin said, "He started it." Gary said, "He started the persimmon part. You built the rest." Marin said, "Same idea." They stood on the ridge for a while in the cold, looking at the pond, which had a dozen mallards on it that hadn't been there before the water development. Gary hadn't planned for ducks. They were a consequence of building something that worked, an unintended abundance that arrived because the conditions were right. Let me tell you about the check, because the check is how this story announced itself to the county, and because the announcement was the part that finally, after 33 years, brought the full weight of what Harlan Tesdall had done in 1979 into public view. In February of 2013, the Chickasaw County Extension Service held its annual farm management meeting at the fairgrounds in New Hampton. It was the kind of meeting that drew 200 farmers and lasted all morning, with presentations on input costs and crop insurance and equipment financing and the usual array of concerns that occupied the minds of people trying to make a living from the land. Marin Tesdall had been invited to present on alternative revenue sources for marginal farmland, which was a topic the Extension Service had added to the agenda in response to the 2012 drought and the income losses it had caused. She stood at the front of the room with a projector and a set of slides that her father had helped her